Welcome to Juva Guitars. My name's Chris. Behind the camera is Matt. As always, and it's another episode of the 3,000-year-old guitar build series. And in this episode, we're going to put the nut on this guitar. It's pretty much the last piece of major construction that we need to do before we can put strings on it. So it's kind of a momentous occasion, and I'm really excited to get through it. As you guys remember, in the last episode, we went through all of the steps that we needed to do to make the saddle and get the bridge pins all set up. And a lot of the things that we're going to do in this episode are very similar to that one, because working with cattle bone is working with cattle bone. But let's just get right into it. I've gone ahead and gotten myself, these are the, I think these are about 1/4 of an inch wide when you get them. Here you go. Here's an example of kind of what it looked like before I went ahead and kind of thinned it out and got it to where I wanted. But just like in what I did on the saddle, I just took a piece of nice flat piece of acrylic that I have with some sandpaper on it, and I ran this just back and forth and worked myself around with it until I got it to do this over here, which I got dust everywhere. Which is to just get this to sit perfectly and nicely, exactly. Oh man, I gotta spin around. There you go. It just fits absolutely perfectly inside that saddle slot. Looks really good. Just like we did with our saddle, the other thing besides making it the correct thickness is I ran it through with our little race car tool here so that we got ourselves a perfectly squared off bottom end on it. It's nice and flat, sits inside this slot and looks really good. So what do we need to do to get this thing cut to size so that it fits right and that we can put the nut slots inside of it? What I do is I've got myself a classic like number 2 style pencil, and we have like 2 or 3 of these floating around the shop. And I just take it to an edge sander and sand it completely down so that it's basically half of its profile. We've got ourselves a really nice sharp point on here. Is that picking up? Hopefully it's picking up, right? Yeah. So what I like to do is I just set this right here on top of the frets, and we're gonna make sure that this thing does not move, and we're just gonna mark a line right across here. Right? Makes sense. And because we have a nice sharp tip on this pencil, I like to also take it and then I run it across here. I run it across on the other side. We go ahead and we mark the bottom. And we're going to mark the bottom on the other side. And what I do now is I can pull this out. And you can see here, that's basically exactly what we need to do. I'm going to run over to the edge sander and we're going to sand this. But I do want to give you a word of caution. You do not want to sand all the way to this pencil line. What I find works perfect for me is I sand to just above it. I'd say 1/4 of a millimeter, maybe 1/2 of a millimeter, but really I like to go just about to the pencil line. That gives me just enough meat, literally on the bone, I guess in this case, so that I can actually take my nut slotting files and still have something of material there that I can put a notch into it. Because you don't want to end up with these super deep notches for your fret slot or for your string slots, but you also want them too shallow. So I do find that if you just go to just above that pencil line, that it is perfect. So we're going to go to the edge sander, get that radius in, and then we're going to start working the sides of it so that we can get it to fit inside this slot without any protrusions on the side. So we'll be feeling to make sure that we don't have any just excess bone sticking out of there. So it's just a little bit of a dance, kind of a back and forth that you've got to do to get it right. So let's begin the dance. All right, so let's see if this picks up on camera, but you can see here, we are just shy of getting into the pencil mark. If anything, I'm gonna go a little bit higher on the bass side than I am on the treble side, just because those strings are obviously a little bit thicker. We've sanded into the pencil lines just on the side, but what's probably gonna happen, I haven't tested this out yet, is we're gonna set this on it. Yeah, and what we have is just a little bit of protrusion on here. So what I'm gonna do at this point is I actually typically at this point don't go over to the edge sander again. I'll actually use sandpaper. I'll actually just come over here, we'll do it. I use just some sandpaper that I have, and I'll start doing this by hand just to get it to go, because this isn't typically perfectly 90 degrees because you kind of have the flare of the headstock beginning at this point on the guitar. So I'll start doing this by hand just to get it to its perfect at this point. It's easy to go too far. That's the main reason. So we'll just do a little bit and we'll check. Always making sure that your pencil mark is facing that way because that's going to be the side that faces the guitar. And we're going to work it. And that might have been almost perfect just there. I mean, now it's just so close. So really, really close. Go to a finer sandpaper. Doesn't take much. That's gonna do us right there. The other thing that I like to do, just to guarantee that the top of this nut is at the exact same radius as our fingerboard, is I'm gonna run over here, put this inside of our nut vise real quick, and we're gonna take our 16-inch sanding block that we use to radius our fingerboard, and I'm actually just gonna go like this real quick. Just give it a quick hit, just so that we know that it's an exact match to that same radius. You don't have to do that. It's just something that I always do. At this point, we have what I would call a roughed in nut. Like it's far from finished yet. But this is a really good time for us to begin putting our slots inside it. I'm trying to decide if I want to go one more. Yeah. Let me grab some different sandpaper. What I'm getting is just the tiniest of little nubs, just a little burr on the end of these. So instead of coming over to that, what I like to do, this is a 320 grit, and I'm just gonna use the fat of my fingers to just kind of like soften it up a little bit. And usually that's what I want, just enough to get it so that it doesn't feel like it's protruding at all. Let's just see what that feels like. It's kind of like impossible to get this across in video because it's just a feel thing. But yeah, that's perfect. I don't want to feel it at all with my hands because you'll feel it for sure when you're playing the guitar. Okay, so this is in place. Feels really good. I know that all my basic dimensions are in place. I haven't polished it yet, and that's an important step. I want to have it to be a nice satin finish at this point because polished nuts don't take to a pencil mark very well. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to do just like we did for our string spacing down on the saddle. I'm going to use this string spacing rule that we've got, once again from StuMac. We'll put links to all of these tools in the description down below. Let me put my optivisors on. My Erlewines, as I call them these days. Just like we did on the saddle video where I was talking about setting my string spacing down there, what I like to do with this. So I've got, you can barely see it, I've got one right here that says GS, that stands for Grand Session, which is what this model is, and that's what has worked for me in the past. And the way that I do it is I typically find some outside spaces, or I want to get one where the outside touches exactly to the outside of the neck at the nut position, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there we go. I've got one here that is touching, and I've got one here that is touching. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bump that up against my nut, and we're going to mark the next one. And then we're going to skip one because it's 6 strings, obviously. And we're going to go across, and we're going to mark all of these. And those are going to represent where our slots are going to go. So that gets the idea. I'm going to do this over a device without Matt and my grill so that I feel like I can't see. I just want to make sure that I get it right. I just wanted to get that point across to you guys on how I'm doing it. So I'm going to use my string spacing rule, and I'm going to come in 1 notch from the outside, and that's going to be perfect. If you don't have one of these rules, which, come on, just buy one of these rules. You've worked so hard to build this guitar at this point. This is going to keep you from having a guitar that doesn't play like crap. Buy the tool and you'll be a happy camper that you did. But if you don't, then you're going to have to do all this marking off with dowel calipers, which is its own bag of worms. And there's a lot of opportunities to mess up. There we go. I guess the more correct way to use this tool is like this. You use the slots that are on here. And that represents our string spacing. Right? Mm-hmm. And each one of those pencil lines at this point represents the center of where the string is going to go. So I've spun this around so it might look a little bit different, but I have my nut blank inside the vise here. We've got our we've got our string spacing locations on here absolutely perfectly. They look good. I'm going to check just one more time to make sure that it's right, just because, once again, if you don't get these in the right spot, you are going to be paying the piper. I'm going to redo them actually, just because they are slightly off to one side. So one more time with feeling. So that's absolutely perfect. Really happy with that. Okay, so we need to cut our string slots at this point. Move these over here. What we're going to use is our diamond files that we have. StuMac sent us these years and years ago, and we use them, and we absolutely love them. These diamond files are very expensive, but we do this for a living, so we use the diamond files because they're quicker and they last a really long time. We'll put links down below to the non-diamond files so that you don't have to spend hundreds of dollars to get yourself a nut slot file. I want to say a word of caution here to you though. If this is your first guitar and you're building this, you've been following along with the series, and it's time for you to do this, there's going to be a real strong urge for you, especially if you're on a budget, to just like do this with like jeweler's files. You really need to do this with nut slotting files, and you can find nut slotting files for real cheap on eBay and on Amazon and TeamU and all that stuff. If this is going to be a one-time job for you, still buy some nut slotting files. And you'll see on the files that we have here, I've gone ahead and put labels on them that represent the gauge that each file is. What I like to do is to use one size up. So like on this string, it's going to be actually a 12 and we're using a 13. On this one, it's a 16 and we're going to be putting a 20 on it. This is going to be a 24. We're doing a 28. I think that makes sense. I like the slot to be just a kiss wider than the intended gauge of string that you're going to put on the guitar. In my case, these guitars go out to people who I'm not going to be there to babysit, obviously. So I want to give them a little bit of wiggle room on different brands of strings that they're going to be using on the guitar. So, but you want it as close as possible to the one that you're going to use. I digress. It's time to cut these slots. What I like to do is actually use my thinnest one, my number 13. And I'll go through and I'll just go ahead and hit all 6 of these with the number 13. Because what I do find is as you start to go up, like to the 56th thou here, is it's so wide, it's very difficult to find that you're on the center line. So by going ahead and notching it with the thinnest one as possible, it gives me, by the time I get to that one, I can just let that sit right in that slot and guarantee that it's centered. I think that makes sense. So yeah, I'm just gonna go through and we're going to very carefully make sure that we're on our pencil line. And we're staying perpendicular. And that's all I'm doing right now is I'm just using this to mark, essentially. Being careful that we're not moving it all off of that pencil line that we put down. You'll notice that I kind of start over here. I'm exaggerating, but I go ahead and get started here just so that I don't erase my pencil mark as I'm getting started. And I'll probably put some pencil lead in there just so that everybody at home can see better. Okay, we've got all 6 marked. What I'll do now is I'll now move up. So that was our number 12 or our 13. So we're gonna go up to the B string now. I'm just touching it. 28th thou. We're just touching it. And now it's easy. I don't have to spend as much time paying attention to getting it perfect because we've gone ahead and marked it with that smaller file. This is the 36. I'm actually going to go ahead and start these ones with the 36 as well because the larger files don't even fall into that smaller slot. We're going to hit it with the 46 for the A string and the 56 for the E string. Let's see if, can you come this way, Matt, and kind of show them where there's a little bit of a glare. So this is very shallow. I have these nut slots just ever so shallow into here. They're enough that when we go to put strings on this guitar that the string's gonna have a spot to fall into, but not much more than that. Because I don't want to try to get these down to their final position just now because the guitar is going to tell me what that position is, right? So if you go too low right here, what's going to happen is you're going to make this nut and you're going to get it all shaped and it's going to be beautiful and you're going to glue it in. And then you're going to go to string up the guitar for the first time and it's going to be buzzing like crazy. Remember that this last step that we're going to do after this nut is made is put strings on the guitar. And we don't expect that when we put the strings on the guitar right out of the gate that it's just going to be perfect. We want that action to be a little bit higher in all directions than we want it to be in its final setup, because by having it set high it gives us some wiggle room to bring everything back down to where it was. So don't go too far with these, especially if you're using these diamond files, because they go super easy. Now that we've got these marked and they're in place, what we can do is we can finish shaping this nut into its final shape, and that's pretty straightforward. What I like to use is, just like in the last episode, our trusty US government issued triangle file, as well as this razor file. I don't know that these are rated for doing this, but I find that it works really good for shaving the bone on these nuts. So I'm going to spin this around, face matte with it. And once again, we'll put links to all these things in the video description down below, all these tools that you guys see here. Making sure that, have I lost it? Did I ever have it? Yep, we've got a little bit of pencil. Sometimes you can even put a pencil mark on there, and that pencil mark is representing that that's facing the body of the guitar. Then you also can do it by seeing your string gauges that you have here. This is my E, my low E, and my high E. So what we need to do is on the back side, because this is going to be the headstock side of the nut, is that we need to curve. We're going to go ahead and basically put a curve into the nut that's like that, right? That was terribly drawn, but that makes sense, right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to put this, spin this around. I'm going to barely just get it chucked into this nut vise. So I take my diamond, or my what are these called? The razor file. This just works really well for this. You don't have to have a razor file to do it. And I kind of just put an initial 45-degree angle into it. You see how it just puts off really nice shavings. This is a really good example here, this step, of why the this nut vise is super useful, because if I didn't have this and I was either in this vise or just a standard like machinist vise, you can see you wouldn't have the clearance to put such a steep angle on this. And that's why those jaws being set up and out of the way, it just gives you a lot of room to put angles on both the saddle and the nut. So it's not expensive. I have 2 or 3 of these things and they're amazing for all kinds of stuff. I even use it at the drill press for holding things all the time. So a little bit of a splurge of a purchase if this is your first guitar, but it really does make a difference. We're not taking any off the top at all. I'm not going past, basically I'm flat from here forward. Everything on the back side of that is rounded over. I think you should be able to hopefully see that. Yes, in that footage that's right there. Okay, so it's looking a little rough because it's on the file. Let me grab some sandpaper and I'll show you how I make it look good. This is some 320. I like to hang off the side here, and we just do like a little shoe polish method here. We're just rounding over that whole spot. Remember to not come into those slots that you've just cut. It is fine to come across the top. You're just trying to get rid of any deeper sanding marks that you might have. We'll move it over to the other side. Okay, now the only other thing that we really need to do before we can call this nut done is we don't want it to be squared off on the ends. I like to round those pieces off a little bit. We don't want to round it off so far that it's coming into the outer E-strings. So the easy way to do this, at least that I find, is to get a new piece of sandpaper. And we don't want to be taking off material off the full side, but we do want to be taking it off this way. And I'm just going to hit this and round this over, soften up that hard edge that's on it. And this is 320 grit. And you can see how quick it's going. So you don't need to swing for the fences with like a super coarse sandpaper here. So a note on this, we don't want to round off this bottom corner because that's tucked into the headstock overlay. And if you round that over, you're gonna have a gap there that looks bad. But we do want to round over the side and this back upper corner of the nut. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And this is kind of just to your own taste. Same thing on the other side. Yeah. That's looking good. Let's set it on here and see what it looks like. By the way, your shop's gonna smell awful during all of this process. It smells like burnt hair. It's just like the bone dust is just brutal. That looks really nice. I feel really good about that. We obviously still need to cut these slots, like I said, to their final depth, but we're not gonna do that until we put strings on this guitar. So the last thing that I wanna do before we glue this nut into place is just put it on the buffing wheel real fast so that we can get it a nice shine. Word of caution, don't get ahead of yourself and put a shine on this nut until after you've cut the slots, because once it's all shiny and buffed out, it's impossible to mark it with pencils. It's impossible to mark it with Sharpie. Your file wants to slide all over the place. So just by having a little bit of a rough surface on here, it just gives your tools a little bit more purchase so that you can get it how you want. So I'm gonna hit this on the buffing wheel real fast and we'll get it glued on. Okay, let's see how far we've come. Let's show where we started and where we are now. Looks really, really nice. I'm really happy. It's kind of crazy because this one was as dark as this one when I first started. But the nut was inside there. You just had to chisel it out like Michelangelo used to say.
So you're saying you're the Michelangelo of nuts?
Exactly. This is the last thing we're gluing on this guitar, I think, right? So what I like to do to get the nut glued in is to just use a little bit of this number 20 super glue. I don't go crazy with it. I'll show you kind of where I'm at with it here in just a second. We do want this nut to be able to come out if we need it to. I like to use this brush on accelerant. Just kind of get it, making sure not to get the glue all over the headstock. And I set it on with my fingers on each side of it so that I can make sure that it's perfectly centered. And Bob is your uncle. That looks really, really good. Okay, so the elephant in the room at this point is that this guitar is actually completely finished, and the only thing left to do is to put strings on it. It's been 3.5 years, and I'm really excited to hear what it sounds like. But we were talking to Will, the gentleman who's getting this guitar, a wonderful local musician here. He's a buddy of mine, and what we're going to do is we're going to string this up in the next episode and then have him play it for you guys. He's going to sing a little song for you. It's only right that we do it kind of with a little bit more fanfare, because everybody who's been following along with this video series has waited so long. God knows we've gotten all the grief from you guys. We've had a lot of fun. We've laughed, we've cried, and we want to send this guitar off in its final episode with what it deserves, and that's like a little bit more fanfare. So what we're going to do here is we're going to park. We're not going to put strings on it, and in the very next episode, which we will be shooting any day now, so it's not going to be like months from now, I promise you, we'll get this strung up, and you guys are finally going to get to hear what it sounds like. Matt and I are finally going to get to hear what it sounds like. It's not like we know what it sounds like. Yeah, it's been really exciting. So hope you guys learned something on this episode. We do have a few more things that we're going to do besides put strings on it. We are going to show you how we do a proper setup on a newly strung up guitar. So stick around for that, and we'll see you guys in the next and last episode. Thanks, guys.